What drives agricultural innovation probably more than anything? Well, as the saying goes, it's the economy, stupid. Specifically the farm economy, which, at least in North America, is largely built on one very important foundation: exports.
So exports aren't just important. Global markets aren't just important. They are vital. And without global markets, there would be no demand for certain products. That's why international trade is so critical and so key for agriculture.
Dr. William Ridley is an agricultural economist, specifically a trade economist at the University of Illinois. And this is definitely a consequential time to be taking a close look at global agricultural trade.
So as the U.S. has kind of locked itself out of the Chinese market through these trade war, well, I'll call them trade war shenanigans, who has stepped in? It has been Brazil. And they're starting to eat our lunch in a lot of ways, where once it was U.S. soybeans going to the Chinese market, now it's Brazilian soybeans.
One of Bill's big concerns, along with many other economists, is the long-term effects of adversarial trade relationships.
These tariffs, these trade disputes cause lasting damage. And even if we were to rescind all of these tariffs tomorrow and say, oh, false alarm, sorry we did that, it doesn't undo the damage that has been done.
We're talking agricultural trade with economist Bill Ridley on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, economists, entrepreneurs, and other interesting perspectives shaping the future of the ag industry. Today's episode, in my opinion, is very timely and very thought-provoking. The farm economy is struggling yet again this year. And while there's no one single cause for all of that struggle, and the problems do vary, exports certainly play a role, certainly a major role. I'm very pleased today to welcome Dr. Bill Ridley onto the show. Bill is an international economist studying global markets and trade policy at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research explores pressing market and policy issues relating to international agricultural trade, economic integration, trade disputes, and the implications of globalization for the environment and natural resource use. I wanted to bring Bill onto the show here today to ask about the implications of tariffs and trade disputes for the farm economy today, his perspective on the current trade relationship with China, his work on the virtual water trade, which is this really interesting concept that measures how much of our domestic water resources are getting used to export food out of the country. Also, his thoughts on the path forward from here on all of this. And if you're hoping for a happy ending, rosy picture of how all this plays out, I'm going to go ahead and warn you right now, you might be disappointed. But it's certainly an important topic to be thinking about deeply and to be considering how this impacts your business, my business, all of our businesses, if they are at all related to agriculture and the farm economy. I'm going to drop into the conversation here where Bill is talking about what drew him into working on these agricultural trade issues.
All along, I've been really enthusiastic about studying these policy issues, particularly in global commodity markets, agricultural markets. And I think the agricultural space is such an interesting one to analyze because it's always such a vibrant policy arena. There's always something going on. Now more than ever, I think that's apparent with all the trade disputes and the trade negotiations and just the endless list of things that are always happening in global agricultural markets.
Yeah, why do you think that is? What is it about agriculture that makes it such a vibrant policy arena, as you said?
I think it's that with agriculture, and this is true of a lot of industries and a lot of settings, but agriculture in particular, you have a lot of entrenched interests. You have industry groups, you have commodity groups that say, we are either vehemently opposed to free trade or we are active proponents of free trade. There's really a lot at stake for a lot of different groups in a lot of different ways. And I think because so much is at stake, number one, and number two, because global markets are so important for the agricultural sector. Exports are really a big deal for just about any commodity you might name. I think that's what makes trade such a salient topic within agriculture and why policy issues can be so contentious and so controversial in this area.
Could you give us a sense, and I don't necessarily have an answer in mind here, but I'm sure you're better at conceptualizing this than I am. Give us a sense of how much the American agriculture industry relies on exports?
Yeah, so it really varies by commodity. So for some products, corn, I'll pick as an example. Of course, exports are huge, billions of dollars. But the domestic market arguably is the more important market to consider. By contrast, you have commodities like your soybeans, your sorghum, your cotton. Those are the big ones, but there's certainly others where exports are really the be all and end all. There is not much of a domestic market for cotton, for sorghum, just to use those examples once again. So exports aren't just important. Global markets aren't just important. They are vital. And without global markets, because of course we're not processing much cotton here domestically, but without global markets, there would be no demand for certain products. That's why international trade is so critical and so key for agriculture.
Yeah. And corn, just as a random aside, is the importance of the domestic market, has that been bolstered in the last kind of 25 years through ethanol and kind of biofuels?
Oh, inarguably. It's that you have these policy supports kind of to create demand out of thin air. And there's all sorts of debates surrounding those ethanol rules and renewable fuel standards and all of this. So yes, there is certainly a large, I guess if you want to call it an artificial domestic market, you could call it that. And I think there's impetus to do something like that for soybeans, get soybeans into the, biodiesel fuel supply chain. But yeah, it varies by commodity. And there are all these idiosyncratic, these unique issues particular to certain commodities. With corn, you have the ethanol standards. Things like soybeans, you have issues related to global markets and trade wars. And that's what I find so intriguing about this area. It's just, any commodity you might analyze, any market you might consider, there's always something fascinating going on.
It is interesting. You'll have to point me towards a good corn economist who could help me understand why, if corn is not as reliant on exports and international trade, how come the price isn't faring better during these times? But that's a whole nother conversation. You pointed me towards an article that was describing the fact that our trade deficit in 2025 has widened. In fact, it's been kind of going negative, if you will, since 2022. Can you talk about that, about what's going on with our trade deficit? And then we'll get into some factors maybe driving that.
Yeah, so, just in plain terms, a trade deficit reflects the difference between what we export and what we import, right? And if there's a deficit, that means we've all of a sudden begun to import more than we export in dollar terms. And for the longest time, for decades and decades, the U.S. ran a pretty substantial agricultural trade surplus, which I don't think will surprise anybody. We're a massive agricultural producer and exporter. Exports vastly outweighed imports. And that was the case for quite a long time. But only in the last couple of years, we've actually seen that reverse. That's changed. It's that now imports are exceeding exports. It's that we're buying more product from the rest of the world than we're selling to the rest of the world. And it continues to grow larger. And in fact, we're in the neighborhood of around, I think the forecast is about $40 billion of an agricultural trade deficit by the end of 2025, which is a dramatically different situation from where we were for most of the recent history. Some people seem to be concerned about that because they say, well, all of a sudden we're buying more of our food and ag goods from the rest of the world. We're relying on foreign sources. And I think a lot of people, there's a bit of trepidation about that. There's open debate about whether this is actually a good thing or a bad thing in particular. And we can dig into what the numbers tell us, because a trade deficit has two components. It has an export component and an import component, right? But once you dig into these two components, I think at least from my perspective, it's not so clear that it's something to be worried about necessarily, even though that's how it's been framed in a lot of the media. And there's been a lot of, the sky is falling sort of pronouncements that this is a disaster. But like I said, once you really dig into the statistics and the market dynamics and what's driving this, I think there's a little bit less cause for concern there.
What are you seeing that makes you think the trade deficit isn't necessarily a reason to be panicking?
Yeah, so I'll say don't panic, but with qualifications. So when you really dig into this trade deficit story, we can talk about the export component first. Agricultural exports have mostly remained stable from the U.S.'s perspective. They haven't really gone down, although they haven't really gone up so much in recent years. So they've been stable, and it's not exports driving the trade deficit that we see. Rather, it's the import side of the story. But before I talk about the import side of the story, there are worrying trends when it comes to U.S. agricultural exports. Another word for stable is stagnant. It's that it hasn't really grown in past decades, and I think that's a cause for concern. There are a lot of reasons for that, or reasons that you might hypothesize about. What I'm particularly concerned about, and what I think just about every producer or industry representative should be really worried about, is the potential effects of ongoing trade disputes, and in particular, what's going on with China. And I guess we can talk about that in more depth later. But I think there's really worrying signs on the horizon for what our agricultural trade relations with China are about to experience. So on the export side, there are worrying trends, even though for now things have remained stable. What's driving this on the import side, is why I don't think it's such a cause for concern, because once you dig into the numbers and you dig into the commodities that are driving this, several $billion of these increased imports from other countries are reflected in commodities like canola oil from Canada. That's a big one. Multi-billion-dollar increase in canola oil imports. It's things like avocados from Mexico, where, of course, American demand for avocados has been exploding in the last few decades. And I don't think most economists would look at that and say, well, what a calamity, what a disaster. We're importing more avocados from Mexico or canola oil from Canada. I mean, if you want to take a pessimistic view, you say, well, that might be driving out like some American competition, like you're buying canola oil rather than corn oil. But by and large, I don't think economists are so concerned about the import side of the story. Nor do I think other folks, industry people or whoever, should be so worried about these trends. That's on the import side, but like I said, on the export side, there are dark clouds on the horizon, I think.
Yeah, and what does that look like? The stagnating exports, do we have much of a sense of what is causing them to stagnate? Is this just competition from, places like South America? Is it sort of population stagnation, starting to stagnate? All the above?
Yeah, all of the above. So I'll try to unpack what I think are the most important ones. You highlighted the issue of competition, global market competition, particularly from South America and particularly from Brazil. I don't think anybody's surprised to hear that Brazil has really come online in a major way as a big-time producer of key commodities like your soybeans, your cotton, your beef, et cetera, et cetera. And really what that has entailed is really dramatically expanded agricultural exports to China, right? So as the U.S. has kind of locked itself out of the Chinese market through these trade war, well, I'll call them trade war shenanigans, who has stepped in? It has been Brazil. Brazil has stepped in a major way, and they're starting to eat our lunch in a lot of ways, where once it was U.S. soybeans going to the Chinese market, now it's Brazilian soybeans, right? And that's happening in conjunction with these trade disputes that the Trump administration has kicked off. And China has been kind of the biggest adversary in all of these. And we're seeing a repeat in a lot of ways of the first U.S.-China trade war. China says, we're not going to buy your commodities, we're not going to buy your soybeans and your pork and your sorghum and all of this. So, this kind of combination of global market dynamics that are really, have, I think, pretty dire implications for the U.S. agricultural trade position.
And I think a common response to that has been, oh, well, China needs us just as much as we need them. Is that still true, or was it ever true?
Yeah, I think it may have been true at some point, because China's demand for a lot of your soybeans and your sorghum and all of this was so massive they just couldn't supply themselves. And Brazil alone couldn't supply them, right? So they had to go to the U.S. But I really think that the first trade war back in 2018, 2019, I think it changed their attitude. They said, well, the U.S. is no longer a reliable trading partner in a lot of ways. They start these arbitrary trade disputes. They penalize us with tariffs, that sort of thing. And I think they've undertaken a really big effort to, I'll say, wean themselves off of U.S. agricultural exports. And that's come about by buying more stuff from Brazil. There have been these massive efforts towards self-sufficiency in terms of domestic Chinese agricultural production. So huge expansions in their domestic support for agriculture, their policy support. Adopting new genetically modified crop varieties, that sort of thing. So I think it's been this two-pronged approach on China's part to no longer be so reliant on U.S. exports. And a lot of those initiatives were spurred by the U.S.'s actions in these various trade disputes. So I think we brought this on ourselves in so many ways. And if you look at the U.S. statistics, they are dire. There's just been a collapse in exports in the last few months, and it's hard to find a silver lining in a lot of this.
Yeah, it's got to be really tough. I understand what you were saying earlier about, when it comes to the deficit, a corn farmer is not going to pivot to avocados to try to fix the trade deficit. Like, it kind of makes sense that we're importing avocados, and exporting something like corn. But stagnation or worse when it comes to exports, play that out for us. What impact does that have on your average Midwest, soybean farmer?
Yeah, in the extreme, you're seeing what we're seeing right now during the current growing season. There have been effectively no soybean purchases on China's part of U.S. soybeans. You say, well, what am I going to do if our very largest market wants nothing to do with our product? Well, in the first trade war, there was a bit of reallocation. You don't export to China, you export to Europe or Japan or whoever, right? But there's only so much product that those markets can absorb. None of them are China. None of them are as large as China. There's been a bit of, I'll call it wish casting. Like, well, if we can't sell to China, what's another large market out there that could absorb all of this product? Of course, India is the other very large country out in the global market. And we've picked a fight with India. We've started a trade war with India. We've put 50% tariffs on their exports coming into the US. So I feel like, we're kind of cutting off any potential escape routes here. You get the stagnation, you get product that nobody wants to buy in the extreme, right? And we're picking fights with other markets to which we might sell what would have gone to China. So I don't think that we've totally reaped the whirlwind yet. I think the worst is yet to come. That's my rosy-eyed view of things. But I think we're doing everything wrong in a lot of ways. And I'm not trying to play pundit. I'm not trying to editorialize or anything. It's just, as an economist, these are really, really worrying trends that we see.
Yeah, they are. And are these unprecedented before the 2018 or so trade war? Do we have any sort of kind of like historical data that we can look back on and see how these types of situations have played out in the past?
Yeah, the short answer is no, not within living memory. I think the best you can do is to go back to these notorious trade conflicts that precipitated the Great Depression. So people will talk about your Smoot-Hawley tariffs, these very large tariffs imposed by the US on imports from the rest of the world, which kicked off this global trade war and this spiral where trade just collapsed globally. But even that, I don't think is a fair comparison, because that was a global trade war. That was everybody going at it at once. What we see here is kind of it's a one-sided fight that the U.S. has picked for, I think, pretty vague reasons. And it's to our own detriment, right? I think there's a hope, well, if we lose these export markets, the government might step in and there'll be paychecks and there'll be bailouts. It might be a reasonable hope. But to your original question, this is unprecedented. I think the only comparison, the only really valid comparison, is this U.S.-China trade war of a few years ago. But even that is dwarfed by what we're seeing going on right now, I think.
Right. And is there a scenario where long-term, we sort of wean ourselves off of the need to sell to other markets and focus more domestically, and it kind of all works out? It's hard to see the gap between here and there as being anything short of treacherous.
Yeah, I think some people have that view that, we don't need world markets. The U.S. is a big place. Maybe we come up with policies that can make up for any lost export markets. This is kind of a pivot in our discussion, but I think the Canadian government is trying to do exactly that. They have their own trade disputes going on with China. Canola being kind of the big targeted product. And if you speak with Canadian canola industry groups, their panacea for these trade-related ills that they face is to essentially reproduce the ethanol standards that we see in the US. Well, if there is no foreign demand, let's create domestic demand, and let's do it artificially through policy. So I think we might see that in the US. What we've got with corn, we'll see more of that with soybeans or other grains. Is that a long-term solution? Is that a viable way to make up for lost export markets? I don't know. If you're an optimist about the current approach to negotiating trade deals, you might think, well, maybe all of these disputes will segue into new trade deals and easier access to foreign markets. Maybe, if you're optimistic, but we haven't seen that yet. I think you ask any farmer, you ask any industry group, you ask anybody, they would love to sell their product to foreign markets, right? That's the big goal here. We want to get rid of as much of our product as possible. And the way to do that, well, sure, we'd like to sell domestically, but if people in other countries want to buy our stuff, and they certainly do, the US is an agricultural powerhouse for a reason, then I think it's just totally backwards and totally silly to be picking these fights with everybody and losing access to foreign markets as a result of that.
Yeah. And you have analyzed these trade dynamics in a way that I think a lot of other people haven't considered, which is in the terms of virtual water. You did at least one research paper called Thirsty for Trade, How Globalization Shapes Virtual Water Trade. Okay, for someone hearing that term virtual water for the first time, can you explain that? And then I want to get into the implications of trade dynamics in virtual water.
Yeah, so virtual water in essence says, well, whenever you grow a crop or raise livestock or what have you, of course, there are resources that get used in producing that output. One of those key resources being water, right? So you need water to grow soybeans, you need water to grow corn. And you can measure the embedded or embodied or whatever word you want to use, the virtual water content of traded products and say, well, when we export corn or we import avocados or this or that, what is the water content? How much water went into producing that commodity, right? So on one hand, you can do that and say, well, this is how much water is moving across borders in virtual terms. But you can take that a step further and you can ask, well, how does trade policy influence those sorts of virtual flows? Or how does domestic agricultural policy influence those sorts of flows, right? And I think one of the key things that results from that sort of analysis, like from looking at things from that perspective, is to say, well, of these trade policies that are out there in the world, and of these domestic policies, like domestic farm supports or whatever you're considering, how do those policy interventions influence the resource content of trade? If we're growing more soybeans because of some sort of policy, we're using more water to do it, then what is the water bill of that sort of policy? It's kind of the big picture view of how we analyze that issue.
And would that be most important in irrigated areas because you're actually kind of using water that would otherwise go elsewhere versus Eastern Corn Belt where there's just they're putting in drainage tile to try to get rid of some of the water. I mean, does it become more relevant to those types of crops and cropping systems?
Oh, certainly. I think the issue is most pressing when you analyze crops or you analyze regions where water scarcity is more of an issue. So you consider places like Nebraska, and you've got issues of aquifer depletion and those sorts of things, or other parts of the world as well. It's not just a U.S. issue, and in fact, other parts this is even more of a pressing issue. One of the famous examples is, in the Soviet Union, that they're growing cotton in the Central Asian republics, which is a fantastically bad place to grow cotton. Cotton being such a water-intensive product, you have the state intervention that's pushing the production of this water-intensive product in a really arid area with really nasty implications for water resources and sustainability and all of these issues. So it's not only is it an interesting topic and something that I think we should all be concerned with, the question of resource use for agricultural production and trade, but increasingly it's a policy relevant issue. I'd say not as much in the US, but globally you're seeing more trade agreements being negotiated. A handful, but it's growing, where these issues are really, they're part of the text of the agreement, issues of sustainability and resource use. So I think it's going to become an increasingly important issue going forward.
And so the way that would look is, would you look at kind of digging into the trade deficit and see kind of what we're importing, what we're exporting, and what sort of the virtual water implications of that deficit are? How would that look in practice?
Yeah, just in terms of the nuts and bolts, like how are we measuring it, that sort of thing?
Not in terms of how we measure it, but how it contributes to decisions being made.
Yeah, well, I'll highlight yet another example. And this is, I think, where a decision is made reactively in terms of policy. I think everybody's aware of this example of growing alfalfa in the middle of Arizona, foreign investors coming in and buying up land. And of course, Arizona being the middle of the desert, water scarcity being such a massive, massive issue in that part of the country. I think everybody quickly realized, well, you have this really strange situation where we're growing this extremely water-intensive commodity, either for domestic use or maybe it's being exported abroad. And it's just not sustainable. It's not a practical use of resources. And in that case, you had authorities step in and say, well, this isn't how we want to be using this extremely scarce resource in the middle of the desert. So I think you have both reactive approaches to addressing that sort of deficit, a water deficit where we're exporting out more water than can be sustainably used, but also proactive approaches that say, well, going forward, recognizing that water scarcity might become an even more pressing issue in different parts of the world or different parts of the country. What sort of policies can we put in place, or how can we design trade agreements in such a way that recognizes that trade isn't just trade, it reflects the use of resources, natural resources, and so forth. So I think it's still a nascent issue. It's still an issue that we're trying to get our hands around, but I think there's more recognition that this is an important thing to analyze.
And do we know whether we run an agricultural virtual water trade surplus or deficit?
I think the numbers that we calculated in our work, it showed that the U.S. runs something of a surplus. I would have to double check on that. I think looking at things from an aggregate perspective, when you talk about virtual water trade or a virtual water trade deficit, I think looking at an aggregate picture really masks a lot of important detail. I think you really need to consider individual commodities. Because when you're growing corn in the Corn Belt, well, we're not so worried about water scarcity, at least here, places like Illinois or Iowa or what have you. But if you're growing corn or sorghum or whatever in Western Kansas or Western Nebraska, like there you really need to have a good accounting of how much water is getting used in that. If you're exporting it to foreign markets, how much of that water is flowing abroad in virtual terms. So I think at the commodity level, that's where you really need to think about these impacts rather than in the aggregate.
It's fascinating. Yeah, it's something that I think we haven't thought a lot about, or at least maybe just I haven't thought enough about, the implications of our scarce resources and figuring them in with the economics of being able to ship these commodities around the world. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and I harass my colleagues all the time by telling them that, look, all of us are at heart trade economists because whatever issue you might care about or whatever issue you might be analyzing, be it policy, be it market factors, what have you, there's always a trade element. And when you think about resource scarcity and water use, you might think, well, that just pertains to, is the aquifer being drained or like, what's the snowpack doing in the mountains on the West Coast, that sort of thing. But those issues, when you translate them into market impacts, are going to be fundamentally related to trade. And that's why I think trade is something that's unavoidable. Like it has to be a part of every discussion when you're talking about policy, when you're talking about resource use, et cetera, et cetera.
And when you see some of these trends of, countries like the US and maybe there's others, or it sounds like Canada, that seem to be more, I don't know what I want to say, nationalistic or more internally focused, does it make you concerned about, it seems like globalization is expanding. Do you worry about deglobalization?
I'll say yes and no at the same time. It's that undeniably in the last few years, the trends that we had seen for so many decades towards globalization, towards tighter economic integration across borders, those trends were either began to stagnate or started to be reversed. We saw things like Brexit. We see things like these trade disputes of the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. Perhaps less on people's radars is what's happening at the World Trade Organization. This multilateral entity that is like a rule-setting body for world trade. And one of its functions is to adjudicate trade disputes, to settle trade disputes between countries. And the U.S. has, for the last several years now, sabotaged its ability to function. It has been vetoing new appointments to the appellate body, which means that trade disputes can no longer be resolved at the WTO. That's a bit far afield from the question you asked, but it's just another data point showing that globalization has really run into some headwinds. So yes, it faces challenges. But if you look at the numbers and you go out and you survey public attitudes towards trade and globalization and this and that, the public remains favorable and as favorable as they've ever been towards free trade, towards economic integration, all of these things. And I'll pivot back to this discussion about agriculture. You can ask any farmer, you can ask any industry group, and they know that trade is important. They know that exports are important. So that it's impossible to turn your back on foreign markets. It just cannot be done. Certainly cannot be done profitably. So yes, it faces headwinds. I think a lot of it has been created by the US, the US policy and US attitudes. And it's not just a Republican or Democrat thing. Is that a global trend? Well, yes, in some ways, but I don't think I don't know how permanent it is, or I hope it's not permanent at least.
And what would it take to start to rebuild the trade relationship with a country like China and India?
Oh boy, I feel like, I've had this discussion before. It's that these tariffs, these trade disputes cause lasting damage. And even if we were to rescind all of these tariffs tomorrow and say, oh, false alarm, sorry, we did that, it doesn't undo the damage that has been done, right? So in terms of how long, I don't know if you ever rebuild some of these markets, certainly not in the short term, maybe not ever. If China has found a new supplier, in Brazil, why would they ever go back to the US knowing that we're just going to pick another trade conflict fight with them? So how quickly do you rebuild? I don't know. I don't think it's going to be quick. I don't know if it's going to be ever. That's a pessimistic outlook, but I think we've seen this movie before. The first US-China trade war resulted in a deal, quote unquote. But after that deal, we've seen trade flows between the two countries just decline and decline and decline. So I think that's the cost of taking a combative approach to trade negotiations, as we've seen.
Yeah. Well, are you seeing anything out there that gives you, a hint of optimism of where this all might be going in terms of agricultural trade for the American farmer?
I guess I'll try to highlight two sources of optimism, although they might be, we'll see if they're a stretch or not. I think the good faith view of the current trade disputes, trade negotiations, whatever you might call them, is that these are negotiations. There is a method to the madness, and that maybe some sort of trade deal will result from all of this. All right. So we've already seen preliminary deals negotiated with places like the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan. On one hand, these agreements are mostly just a set of bullet points, so there's still a lot of ground to cover in terms of the negotiations. On the other hand, I think there are the contours of an agreement coming into focus. For instance, with the United Kingdom, they've pledged to totally remove any barriers, import barriers to ethanol imports. So maybe that translates into some positive impacts for the agricultural sector, or at least downstream products like ethanol. So that's one potential light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe one other source of optimism in the longer term is that I hope people will realize just how important global markets are, particularly within the agricultural sector, even though I think most people already grasp that fact. And hopefully policymakers and voters and everybody on down the line will recognize that trade is good. Trade delivers a lot of benefits. And sure, there's nuance to that. There are pros and cons, pluses and minuses. But free markets are, I think, good in a lot of ways. I think there's something to strive for. And maybe having turned our back on free markets, as we have in the last few years, or free approaches to trade, maybe attitudes will shift. We'll realize what sort of damage is done by trying to turn your back on global markets.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and if I'm a farmer in my area of, I live in southern Idaho, if I'm a farmer here, the way that free markets work for me are if I can find a crop where we have an advantage and a market, right? And so I wonder if, as we lose some of these markets due to these trade wars, I start to be more protectionist because it's not, the free market doesn't seem to be working out so well for me. And now free, I will use in quotes, given the context of the question here, but it sounds like it's sort of once you start messing with those dynamics, it becomes a slippery slope to very protectionist philosophies, policies, etc.
Oh, certainly. And I think it's probably easy for me as an economist, as a university professor to say, hey, free trade is good, go forth and be free traders. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to these issues. It's not so simple as just saying trade barriers are bad, no ifs, ands, or buts. So I agree that there's going to be a lot of nuance in attitudes, and it's not so simple as just like good versus bad. And I think also muddying the waters has been like the policy, the intervention on the part of the government to address any sort of trade losses. As we saw in the first U.S.-China trade war, your MFP payments kind of address these trade losses that farmers experienced. And your attitude is going to be different towards potential losses from a trade dispute if you anticipate that you're going to get a check in the mail to compensate for any losses you experience, right? So whereas like the natural attitude might be to say, well, free markets, free trade, et cetera, if you believe that starting trade disputes is going to secure these concessions from our trading partners, like we're going to browbeat them into freeing up their markets, and you also believe that the government is going to make you whole, is going to save your bacon, is going to send you a check to address any potential export losses, I think that's going to distort attitudes towards trade as well. I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. I think that's just a natural outcome of these dynamics.
Well, I mean, we're talking about obviously very kind of macro factors here, but we have an audience that is in part farmers, and some of them I guarantee are like, okay, I'm seeing all this, what do I do about it? Short of, voting accordingly for the policies that might promote, more exports and better trade relationships. What can I do to my business to try to manage some of this risk out here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think, frankly, your options are limited. I'll draw from there's an article in the Chicago Tribune recently. They interviewed a soybean farmer here in Illinois. It's about 50 miles outside of Chicago. And I think one of his approaches was he saw the clouds on the horizon. He saw, okay, we've got a trade war impending with China. We've seen this movie before. And he was far enough out that he was able to adjust what he was going to plant that year. Okay, now, not everybody can do that. That may or may not be a viable strategy for folks. But he said, he anticipated, look, we're not going to be selling many soybeans to China. I think I'm going to plant other stuff. So I think the article said he was planting wheat, he was doing oats, that sort of stuff. That may or may not be viable at a large scale for a lot of people. But I think that's one thing that people can recognize is that some commodities are really going to be hit hard by these ongoing trade shenanigans. Beyond that, in terms of managing risk, I don't have a lot. I will highlight one thing that I've observed in talking with industry groups and policymakers and et cetera. Of course, a lot of the industry groups came out immediately with statements saying, end the trade wars. We know that this is a bad deal for us. But the statements were pretty neutral at the end of the day. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to upset constituents, members or politicians. And I'm not saying, like ring up your local commodity group and start yelling in the phone and tell them to take, a more aggressive stance. But I think there remains large scope for a lot of these industry groups. And of course, industry groups are comprised of their membership, right? It's not just a monolith. But I think industry groups could, I don't know if they will, but they could take a stronger stand towards a lot of what we're seeing. I don't know how optimistic I am that that'll happen, but change happens on the ground, and I see that's one way to affect change.
Yeah, right. Well, this has been enlightening. I really appreciate this, Bill. These are issues that I've had concerns about for a long time, but it's great to speak with somebody who's looking at the data. And I'm curious for people like me and others who are listening that want to kind of keep their finger on the pulse of trends and indicators of kind of how trade is influencing the farm economy and where the farm economy might be headed. Are there, accessible places where we can kind of pay attention to keep up with this? Maybe not to the depth and level that you go, but from a more casual perspective.
Yeah, so I think a good middle ground, and there's a lot of good media sources, like industry press releases can be pretty informative, I feel. And I'm not going to tell people, go out and read academic papers, because I don't think most people have the stomach for that, academics included. I will highlight as one source, this is a self-plug, but I think it's also a good answer to your question. There's an outlet called Choices Magazine, and that is the official lay publication of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. And in fact, we have a set of articles coming out on this issue of the the ongoing agricultural trade disputes, conflicts, et cetera. It talks about issues pertaining to row crops and specialty crops, and I think we've got a few on livestock and like liquor and spirit exports, because those have been hit hard by retaliatory tariffs and trade partners. So I think there's a lot of good detail that's going to come out in that venue related to the ongoing trade issues that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, got just a couple minutes here left. Anything that we didn't get to that you want to add or emphasize that you think will help people get a more clearer sense of what's happening with, U.S. agriculture trade?
I guess I'll just, number one, I've been asked so many times recently, like, this must be such an interesting time to be a trade economist. The answer is, well, yes, but it's actually too interesting. I wish it were less interesting. I think there's a lot to be said for, smooth seas. It's that right now things are very choppy. We've got a lot of trade policy uncertainty, higher levels than ever before. And there are ways to measure that with numbers, okay, that I won't go into. So uncertainty is the watchword. Trade disputes are the watchword. I think there's a lot of value, like in policymakers and in everybody just recognizing there's a lot of value in stability. There's a lot of value in pursuing free trade through the usual channels, okay? There are no get-rich schemes when it comes to trade negotiations. And trying to browbeat your trade partners into signing a deal, which ends up being a list of bullet points, is not the way to secure lasting market access concessions, right? I don't know how many attitudes I'm going to change with that sort of statement, but it's an earnest statement. It's what I believe, and I think it's hard to dispute the logic of it.
Yeah, the logic and the results, the data. Like you said, what we saw in 2018 is unprecedented, but it's pretty clear where that has led us. And so I really appreciate, how candid you're being and how clear you're being on what's happening out there. So thank you very much for doing this interview.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you once again to Dr. Bill Ridley for joining the show to share his perspective. Definitely want to bring him back again in the future to share more analysis as this trade story continues to unfold. I want to give a big thank you as well to Will Fathour, who is a listener and an economist at University of Illinois. He sent me a great list of other economists I should consider having on the show, and that's how I learned about Bill, and hope to get some of the others from his list on the show in the not too distant future. So thank you again to Will for offering that. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.